One of the most interesting political case studies one day will be written on BC Premier David Eby somehow finding a way to lose the next British Columbia provincial election. His BC NDP are 28%, or at least a month ago they were, 20% above their opposition parties. That should be an easy cruise to a massive majority re-election. But British Columbia Premier David Eby decided that that wasn't good enough for him, and he was going to start really petty fights with federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and demonstrate that a lot of his popularity was utterly hollow. It's very easy to be a popular premier when you effectively have no opposition. And until I would say maybe 3 or 4 months ago, he didn't really have a real opposition because opposition support was split between the BC Conservatives and BC United. The BC Conservatives under John Rustad has now eaten the BC United's lunch. The BC United have no reason to exist and are likely going to be thrown into the trash bin of history. And now BC Premier David Eby actually needs to take things seriously, and he just won't because he has way too much hubris at the moment and believes he can still say and do whatever he pleases. And so when Pierre Poilievre simply wrote him a letter asking if he would join other premiers in opposing the federal carbon tax increase and cancel his own BC provincial carbon tax increase, he decided to be the most condescending man on the planet. To Pierre Poilievre's simple request, BC Premier David Eby said, "I don't live in Pierre Poilievre's campaign office and baloney factory. I live in BC, and I'm the premier, and decisions have consequences. The fact we face is that if we follow Mr. Poilievre's suggestion, there would be less money returned to British Columbians after April 1st than there would be if the federal government administered this increase directly. Because if BC does not increase their carbon tax, the federal government would take over the carbon tax system, at least partially, in that province, because the current federal standard says that if you follow below their federal carbon tax amount, then they will add on a carbon tax to your province to equalize you with the federal system." So what BC Premier David Eby is basically saying is that he is a lackey of Justin Trudeau. He, for no reason, has tied himself to the most unpopular man in the country, Justin Trudeau. And he has attacked a man, Pierre Poilievre, who was actually probably more popular than David Eby is in his own province. And on top of that, about a month ago, David Eby decided to pick a fight with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. It was a little bit more of like a subtle, under the table fight, but he decided to defend his drug legalization program and say that he is not going to go the way of the state of Oregon in the US and end decriminalization. He's actually sticking to it in the face of drug gangs all over British Columbia and now drug gangs in Alberta getting a hold of safe supply drugs. So David Eby, assuming he was so ahead in the polls and he could do anything, has doubled and tripled down on his soft on crime, soft on drugs, and also pro-environmental tax regime that is going to get him absolutely ruined. He was only popular because he didn't have an opposition. And now that his opposition is the BC Conservatives, people actually have a party to go to respond to David Eby's massive incompetence and radicalism. And going after Pierre Poilievre just demonstrated that David Eby is very out of touch with the political zeitgeist going on in Canada right now. The current zeitgeist is small government and getting away from radical progressive programs. David Eby was doing the right thing last year when he was making noises about maybe going out against decriminalization of drugs, walking away from those stupid policies, maybe cracking down on drug crime, making it so that it's easier to build in BC once again. But no, because Pierre Poilievre was ascendant in the Conservative Party, David Eby had to reverse all of those common sense reforms in British Columbia and double down on everything that did not work whatsoever. And that is where we get polls like this, where he's only 6% ahead of the BC Conservatives. And mark my words, the BC United's 15% in this poll is not going to hold up. People are only selecting BCU in the polls before because they assumed that they were going to be the main opposition to the NDP and the Conservatives weren't going to amount to anything. And that's not a bad assumption for certain people to have made. The PCs, or the Conservatives in British Columbia, hadn't won a seat until they've had like Rochdale and the other BC Conservative MLA cross the floor. They hadn't won an election since 1975. Now, when I say an election, I just mean winning a single seat. They hadn't won a single seat since 1975. And before that, the last time they had held any significant amount of seats was 1956. because the Social Credit Party was effectively the real Conservative Party in the province. And so after the Social Credit Party collapsed in 1991, there was no Conservatives whatsoever. And so BC United used to be this kind of big tent party, or BC Liberals before that, for both mostly liberal British Columbians, but some rural conservatives. And because BC United has proven that they're basically no different from the BC NDP, everyone has now actually started shifting towards the BC Conservatives and started taking them seriously. So this 15% that BC United has is going to easily go towards the BC Conservatives. And even just look at that. With the BC NDP at 40% and the Conservatives at 34%, that means if the BC Conservatives can just steal 3% from the NDP, that's a 6% swing, and they're tied. And then if the BC Conservatives can take anything from the U or the BC Greens, or even the other category, they are easily winning a majority government in this province, because the BC Conservatives have a very efficient vote around the rural areas and suburban Vancouver, Burnaby, and those sort of areas around the Vancouver donut. So if David Eby really wants to lose this next provincial election, he is going to keep doing what he's doing, condescending to conservative British Columbians and picking fights with people much more popular than he is. He shouldn't look at the polls showing that Pierre Poilievre only has like a 10% net approval rating, because that 10% is mostly in Western Canada. The only reason that Pierre Poilievre seems at all unpopular in some parts of the country is because of Toronto and because of Quebec. In BC, he is easily more popular than David Eby is, and David Eby is going to get in a stupid boxing match with Pierre Poilievre and effectively hand the election to John Rousted. Anyways, that should be it for me today, guys. I am basically making this video just to predict the downfall of the NDP. Watch and learn how to basically not do politics, and that is what is happening in British Columbia as we speak. Have a good day, everyone.